everyone. Welcome back to Intentional Youth Ministry. Hope you're doing well. Today, I'm going to start a topic with you guys, and I'm simply going to ask this question. Is youth ministry still relevant? Is youth ministry still relevant? Right? If you are watching this and you are in youth ministry, you are a youth pastor, you might undoubtedly say, yes, well, absolutely, youth ministry is still relevant. And you're passionate about it, and you're like, man, this is my life's work. And so maybe that would be your response to that question. The reason I ask this question is because when I look around at the landscape of the local church, when we look around global, like the global church, but the local church across our country, I see this move happening that would kind of say something different. I believe there's a move happening that is trying to basically kind of say that youth ministry is really no longer relevant to the local church. I've had so many conversations with churches now who continue to shift away from doing any kind of youth ministry services, any kind of youth ministry programming, and they try to just really kind of invite them into their weekend service experience with adults. And so let me speak to that for just a second. I think the challenge with that, well, before I get to the challenge with that, let me just talk a little bit about the why. When I talk to churches and I ask the question, why would you do that? Why are you incorporating them in? I hear things like, well, we want them to be a part of the lifeblood of the church. I hear things like, man, hey, we pull them into there because, youth ministry really was founded and started because, man, main service was just too old and stale and boring for students. But now we have these young, irrelevant, trendy kind of pastors, and we have technology and we have these things. And so, man, it's now relevant for young people. So I hear a lot of those kind of things thrown out there. Let me speak to a couple of those for just a moment. So a couple of years ago, I sat down with another pastor, great guy that I've had the privilege to work with, and he's in his 70s. And so he's been around church world for a while. And I started to pick his brain about youth ministry. And I just asked him, hey, back in the early days of the church, when youth ministry really started, so if you look historically at youth ministry in the U.S., like in the American church, really it started to happen like in the 1940s, but it really started to gain popularity in the 50s into the 60s, and it really just continued to climb. So it's back in that kind of time frame that youth ministry really starts to become a thing. And so if you look back and really talk to people who were around and living back then, and you ask them, why did youth ministry really start to become a thing in the church? It had less to do with like what the main service experience was, and it had more to do with the family dynamic in this country. So if you think about it, back in those times, think about like what was starting to happen in our culture back like in the 50s, right? 40s, 50s, 60s. You started to see the family unit really start to deteriorate. Divorce started to grow rampant, right? The divorce rate started to climb. Families started to deteriorate. And because the family unit was starting to deteriorate, there was a need for the church to step in and basically be that and disciple young people and pastor them and pour into them. And so I would argue that if that is really the premise for why we started doing youth ministry in the first place, I would ask you this question. Has the family unit as a whole grown stronger in this country over the last 40 or 50 years? Or has it actually declined over the last 40 or 50 years? And so I think when you look at that reasoning and the why behind why we started in the first place, look, I am always a fan of questioning why we do things and should we do things different? Should we mix things up? Should we change things? Let's not create sacred cows. But I also will say this, it is incredibly dangerous on our parts when we start deciding to change things without understanding the why behind it in the first place. Hopefully you're tracking with me. And so that is so important. That's the number one reason. And then two, to hit the second argument, right, of youth ministry, is it still relevant? Is it still valid? Or should we just engage them into the main services of our churches? Here's what I will say to you. You may be in an incredible church, a life-giving church with a younger lead pastor who is great, and that is awesome. But two things I want to tell you. One, he's going to grow, he's going to age, he's going to get older, right? So he won't always be young, hip, and trendy, number one. But then number two, even if he is young and trendy, I promise you this, when he is crafting his messages and the content that he is communicating on the weekend, he is not thinking about the 12-year-old, the 13-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 16-year-old. He's not thinking about middle school and high school age students in his message intentionally. Most pastors are not. I promise you this. I have the opportunity to be on the broadcast speaking team of the church that I'm a part of. And even myself, who's done youth ministry now for nearly 2 decades, when I'm crafting a message for a main service environment, just to be perfectly honest, my main thought process is not to craft this or tailor this to a middle school or a high school student, right? And so I think we do them an injustice, right? Because there are things that students need to hear in that time of their life that if we're not careful, now we're going to have them engaging in an environment that's cool and they're connecting with God, but we're not helping them to develop in the very things that they need in this season of their life. I want to go a little bit further with this, but we'll continue this conversation next time on Intentional Youth Ministry. So check back soon, guys, and we'll hit the second part of this conversation. Is youth ministry still relevant?